All right, you guys, let's bring it back in. Okay, so as we get ready to jump back in for part 2 or session 2, this is going to be an Old Testament overview. We are going to get to like specifics on how to study the Bible, but I find that it's really helpful to understand the big picture of Scripture in a little bit more detailed way. And so what I want to do is in the next, let's aim for 40 minutes here. I want to give you an overview of the whole Old Testament, so that if you're at Milligan and you're taking Old Testament, my hope is that maybe from this you could like just wing it and pass your class. Okay? So real quick, let me give you the outline that we're going to follow, and then I'm going to go through that outline. So I'll give you the outline, and then we'll start breaking it down. Okay, so my outline is going to be 12-fold, 12 movements. The first is that creation is good. The next is 3 episodes of fallenness. I don't know if fallenness is a word, so I spelled fallen-ness. After that, we have 3 patriarchs. After that, we have Israel comes to Egypt. So creation is good, 3 episodes of fallenness, 3 patriarchs, Israel comes to Egypt. The Exodus is the 5th heading. Israel enters the promised land, the 6th heading. 12 judges, 3 kings of a united Israel. Then we've got 4 more movements. The kingdom splits, the Assyrian dispersion, Babylonian captivity, and return to the land. So we've got the 12 judges, 3 kings of a united Israel, the kingdom splits, Assyrian dispersion, Babylonian captivity, and return to the land. And so if you're going through your Bible, the first book is what? Genesis. You're with me, right? So the first heading we have as we're in Genesis is that creation is good. So God creates the world, everything in it, and he's like, this is good. He creates humanity. He's like, this is really good. And he gives what's known as the cultural mandate, which is how humans are to flourish. And this happens as we are fruitful, as we multiply, as we subdue and rule over or exercise dominion over creation. And this goodness that is introduced to us in the first 2 chapters of Scripture lasts all of 2 chapters. And then in chapter 3, everything changes. And so that leads us to the next heading, which is 3 episodes of fallenness. The first episode of fallenness is Adam and Eve. And so God creates the world, everything in it. He is entering into a relationship with Adam and Eve. And then what happens is Adam and Eve, they are tempted by the serpent, and they believe that they know better than God with how to live their lives. They believe that their life would be better if they were sitting in his place, if they were the one ruling. And so this sin fractures their relationship with God. We immediately see them carrying shame, carrying guilt, trying to clothe themselves with fig leaves, and this begins a spiral away from God. From here, we see murder introduced into the world. Eventually, we get to the second episode of fallenness, which is the flood. Things get to the point where they're so bad that God's like, let's start over. And so he finds Noah. He tells him to build an ark. There's never been rain. Water's only come up from the ground, and so everyone thinks he's crazy. He brings animals onto the ark. Then there's this huge flood that comes through, wiping out all of the old creation. And then there's this hope, right, as we're reading the story that like maybe things will get better, but sin is deeper than the skin. It's deeper than behavior. It's a heart condition. So Noah is still a sinful person. I mean, from the very, very get-go, when the flood resides, we see him planting a vineyard. Who knows how long that takes? And then making wine, so fermenting, and then getting drunk, right? And so it goes bad again. And so things continue to go bad. The flood didn't fix the sin condition. And eventually people are trying to build a tower to God to get to heaven without God in the picture. And that leads us to the third episode of fallenness, which is Babel. All right, so after creation, we have 3 episodes of fallenness: Adam and Eve, the flood, and Babel. That's the first 11 chapters of Genesis. From here in chapter 12, there's a shift. As we're following these genealogies, we eventually meet this guy named Abram. All right? And so the next heading is the three patriarchs of Israel. The three patriarchs are Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So in Genesis 12, God makes a covenant with Abraham. He tells him that he's going to be a great nation. And so he's living in a place of comfort. He's a wealthy man, but God tells him to leave it all and to go, and that God will give him a nation, that he will give him a people that are more numerous than the stars of the sky. And so Abraham believes God, and he goes, him and his wife, Sarah. Now, Sarah is old. She's barren. Abraham is old. And so there's kind of this question of like, well, how are they going to have a kid? Or when is this going to happen? Well, over the course of time, there's no children. And so Sarah thinks, maybe we're supposed to take this in our own hands. So Abraham, why don't you sleep with my servant? And so he does, which is a bad mistake. And then she gets pregnant. She has a son named Ishmael. And so Ishmael comes onto the scene, and they're thinking, this is it. And God goes, no. Like, I want you guys, Abraham and Sarah, I want you two to be a nation. I'm going to give you two a child. And so he promises that Ishmael will be a great nation. That's basically where you're going to get Arabs. But he's like, no, you're going to have a child. And so eventually, Sarah gets pregnant with Isaac. And so that becomes the second patriarch. So Isaac is now on the scene. Abraham and Sarah have their child, and then at one point, God tests him. He tests Abraham. He says, all right, I want you to sacrifice your one and only son. And so Abraham goes up to this mountain. He's with his son Isaac. They bring some servants with them, and he's like, hey, servant, stay here at the bottom. Isaac, grab the wood. Let's go up. And Isaac's like, Dad, there's no sacrifice. He's like, the Lord will provide. They go up to the top. There's nothing there, and so he makes an altar, straps his son down to it, and he's getting ready to kill his son, believing that God, because God's promised him a nation that he's going to resurrect him, obviously, but he's ready to kill his son. And then an angel stops him and says, there's a ram in the thicket. There's a replacement. There's something to stand in Isaac's place. And this is going to be a theme that we'll see throughout the Old Testament, this replacement, this substitute, if you will, of a ram or a lamb or something like that. And so Abraham, I'm like, did they hug? Like afterwards, and was it awkward? Like, it's like, I knew we were going to do this. It's like, get away from me, Dad. All right, and so after that, eventually, like Isaac as this patriarch is the one that God's going to continue his nation through, not Ishmael, but through Isaac. And so Isaac eventually falls in love. He gets married to Rebekah, and so Rebekah and him have twins, right? They get pregnant. They have twins. There's Jacob and Esau. As we meet Jacob and Esau comes out. He's hairy. He's like a little Ewok baby. And then Jacob comes out, and he's smooth skin. Like he's all nice and soft. And so as they grow up, you kind of look at it, and if you're writing the story, you're like, who's going to be the king, or who's going to be the leader? Who's going to be the dude? And so you have Esau, who's like your Bass Pro Shop Duck Dynasty guy. And then you have Jacob, who's like, I prefer the Food Network. And so, but God's like, no, the younger will serve the older, right? Or the older will serve the younger. Like, I'm going to work through Jacob, not Esau. There's stories of deception, and so when Isaac is old and can't see, you wonder, like, how hairy was Esau? Like, Jacob puts animal skin on him and, like, goes up and fixes his dad some porridge. And he basically deceives his brother, tricks his dad into giving him this blessing. Esau gets so upset that he's like, I want to kill you. And so he's, like, soothing himself by sharpening his knife, thinking about the day that he's going to kill his brother Isaac. Or Jacob. So what does Jacob do? Jacob runs away. Like he crosses the plains. He gets as far away as he can. And so as he's across the land, he falls in love with this girl named Rachel. He's like, oh, she looks good. And so Jacob might seem like a pretty boy, soft-skinned and inside, but he's strong. Like he moves a stone that took multiple people to move. So he moves a stone, waters her flock, and presses her with strength. And so eventually he meets her dad, and he's like, I want to marry your daughter. And so he's like, all right, work for me for 7 years. Then Jacob, who deceived his brother and his dad, gets deceived, and then he ends up accidentally marrying Leah, who has like a lazy eye, and no one wanted to marry her, and like who wakes up, he's like, who did I marry? This is not good. And he's like, I still want Rachel. And so he's like, well, work for me another 7 years. And so now he's got two wives, which is one wife too many. And so at this point, eventually, like the last time he met his brother wanted to kill him. And so he's like, man, but my father-in-law is super deceptive and he's a crook. And so we've got to get away. So he tries to escape and he leaves. And then once he leaves, like he gets word that his brother's in front of him who wanted to kill him last time he met. And he knows that his father-in-law is behind him and he's stuck between a rock and a hard place. And then him and God wrestle. It's a really cool story. So there's some cool stories about Jacob wrestling God, about Jacob seeing a ladder coming down from heaven with angels descending and ascending on it, right? And then eventually, Jacob, so we have Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Jacob is going to have Leah and Rachel like have like a birthing contest. Like they start popping out babies left and right between those two women and their servants. And so eventually he has 12 sons. Okay, and so with 12 sons, he's got his favorite, right, which is Joseph. And how do we know Joseph was the favorite? He had a coat of many colors, all right? And so Joseph says, like, brothers, I had a dream that you were bowing down and worshiping me. And they're like, that's not good, so let's throw him in a well. We should kill him. No, let's sell him and make some money. So they sell him into slavery. Through a crazy turn of events, he eventually ends up as a right-hand man to the Pharaoh. So the next heading is Israel comes to Egypt. Okay, so how did Israel get to Egypt? Well, Joseph is the right-hand man to Pharaoh. There's a famine in the land of his dad and his brothers, and so eventually they have to crawl to Egypt to beg for food. So they go to beg for food, and lo and behold, Joseph is the man who is over the distribution of grain, but they don't recognize their brother. And I've wondered like how that happened, but I don't know what Egyptians look like. I just assume that maybe he shaved his head, was wearing makeup. He probably looked very much like a pharaoh, and so they don't recognize that it's his brother. And so eventually he's like, look, you guys, it's me. I'm your brother. I'm the one you sold into slavery. I'm still alive. And what you meant for evil, God meant for good, but I'm in a place to help preserve our family. Meanwhile, God has renamed Jacob. He's like, hey, I'm going to call you Israel. And so Joseph says, hey, go get dad, go get all of our brothers, bring him to Egypt where we can prosper. And so Jacob, who's been changed to Israel, now comes to Egypt with his 12 sons, and these 12 sons begin to fulfill the cultural mandate of being fruitful and multiplying, and they all become the heads of different tribes or nations, and so they basically become a nation within a nation. So all of a sudden, Israel as a nation, a forming nation, has found itself in Egypt. This brings us to Exodus, right? So we're in the next book of the Bible. During the story of Joseph, God gives Jacob a new name, calls him Israel. So now Israel and his 12 sons are in Exodus. As they've multiplied, they're becoming a nation within a nation, and they are a threat. They're a threat to the Egyptians. They're a threat to Pharaoh. Like, what if they try to overthrow something? And so what does Pharaoh do? He chooses to enslave these people. And so this leads us to the next heading. So after Israel comes to Egypt, we have the Exodus. So as Egypt no longer sees Joseph and his family with favor, they're enslaved. And as they're enslaved, the people begin to cry out to God. They're like, God, this isn't right. God, we need to be rescued. We shouldn't be slaves. And so insert Moses. And you're like, who's Moses? Well, he should have been killed, but he was thrown into the Nile River in a basket made of reeds. He floats down. Pharaoh's daughter finds him, pulls him out, goes back to his mom. Is like, will you take care of him? She's like, yes, I will. I know this kid. And he's raised up as an Egyptian. Eventually, he kills somebody. It's bad. He flees. He's like 80 years old, and he stumbles upon a burning bush. And God says, hey, my people are crying out for me to deliver them. I'm going to use you. And he's like, you don't want to use me. I'm weak. I don't speak well. I'm not a good leader. And God's like, I know. I want to show my muscle through your weakness, so I'm going to use you. And so Moses goes to Pharaoh, a guy that was like a brother to him, and says, hey, you need to let God's people go. And Pharaoh's like, sure thing, we're good. No, he's like, no, I'm not going to do it. All right, and so this leads us to 10 different plagues. So there's plagues like frogs and locusts and boils and all these bad things. The 9th plague was darkness, which is interesting. We'll come back to that in the New Testament. All right, but then the 10th plague was the death of the firstborn son. And so for Israel, there was this promise, though. Hey, if you guys kill a lamb, take the blood and put it over your doorpost, the spirit of death that comes through here to take the firstborn sons will pass over your houses. And so trusting for the blood of this lamb to be their substitute, right? To be in their place, to die in their place, the Spirit comes through. And then for Israel, they're spared, but for all the Egyptians, they lose their firstborn sons, including Pharaoh. This breaks Pharaoh, and he's like, okay, go. So Moses takes the people, and they leave. They leave in haste. So when they celebrate the Passover, this is the type of event they're remembering. All right, so they leave in haste. They get to the Red Sea. They're like, we can't cross this thing. What happens? God splits it. They go through the Red Sea, and then as Pharaoh's changed his mind and sent the army after them, and they enter the Red Sea, the sea collapses in on the Egyptians, but Israel has been delivered. They are safe on the other side. And so now they're on the other side, and they take this journey to Mount Sinai. Okay, it's at Mount Sinai that God gives Moses the 10 Commandments. He gives Moses the law. He gives Moses instructions for building a tabernacle. And so they spend about a year at Mount Sinai. And so this is where you would get Leviticus. So of the 12 tribes of Israel, one of the tribes is the tribe of Levi. All priests in Israel are Levites. Not all Levites are priests, but all priests are Levites. Okay, so not all Levites are priests, but all priests are Levites. So he gives Moses the instructions for the sacrificial system. He gives this book to the Levites to show them how to be priests, which is really significant because the priest's primary function was to help people who were far from God come near to him. Okay, the priest's primary function was to help people who are far from God to come near to him. So we see the seriousness of sin. We see how it separates us from God. We see the need for a sacrifice. And the priests are ministering these things to help people who are far come near. And so what Jesus is Jesus is a better priest. So Jesus ultimately is our better mediator. He's our better sacrifice. He's the one who helps us who are far come near to God. But if you read Peter's works, he says that we are a royal priesthood, which means Christians also have a function to help people who are far from God come near. So Leviticus is actually really applicable for us. Maybe we'll preach through it one day. Okay, and so Moses writes Leviticus while they're at Mount Sinai. And then after Exodus, where they've built this tabernacle, they've messed up. They also did a whole golden calf thing, and Moses broke the commandments, had to get some new ones. Right? Eventually we get to Numbers. Okay, so Numbers, they depart Mount Sinai after a year. And so they're going towards the promised land. That's an 11-day journey from Mount Sinai, 11 days. So halfway there, they send spies out ahead of them. They go to the land, and they're like, those people are big. They look like NBA players. I don't think we can take them. And so 10 of the spies say we can't do it. 2 of the spies, Caleb and Joshua, say we can. And so they're like, we can't do this. And so a whole generation of people who witnessed God working through the 10 plagues, who witnessed God split the Red Sea, who witnessed God revealing himself to Moses on the mountain. Like, these people have seen God work. They've seen God's patience and grace when they have been disobedient and unfaithful. Like, these people have seen God at work. They've seen God guide them and protect them. They're like, I don't think we can overthrow those giants. We should go back to Egypt. They're like, we should go back to Egypt. Like, let's get back. And God's like, are you kidding me? Like, okay, so for this whole generation, he's like, I'm going to give you what you want. You don't want to go to the promised land? So for 40 years, none of your generation are going to get to go to the promised land. I'm not sending you back to Egypt, but I'm not going to let you go to the promised land. So for 40 years, they wander through the desert. All right, God leads them by a pillar of fire by night, a cloud by day. He gives them manna. There's some crazy stories in the desert wanderings. I mean, striking rocks and water coming out, venomous snakes coming out, and there's a prophet and a talking donkey. There's some cool stuff in Numbers, not just a bunch of genealogies. But all this happens, and then we eventually get to a whole generation passing away, and now there's a new generation coming up, and they need a retelling of the law, which gives us Deuteronomy. So Deuteronomy is a second telling of the law. It's a repeating of the law. So Moses gives a new generation a new understanding of God's law, what it looks like to worship him, what it looks like to be his people. And then Moses, as the last of the rebellious generation, passes away without ever entering the promised land. And that leads us to Joshua and to our next heading, which is Israel enters the promised land. So Joshua, as someone who was discipled by Moses, leads the people across the Jordan River. They go to Jericho, oldest city in the world, and there's big walls there. And so for the first 6 days, they march around the wall one time. And then the seventh day, they march around it 7 times. They blow trumpets, and the walls come tumbling down. Like, I don't know if we teach that in our children's ministry, but we got up our game, right? Like, kids need to know these songs, right? So the walls come tumbling down, and now Israel has a city. Like, they have their land. They have the promised land. It's not a nation within a nation. It's not a nomadic nation on the move. It's a nation that has their own land. The rest of Joshua is filled with some battles with Canaanites, and then eventually Joshua gives them a choice. They can either be faithful to God or they can be rebellious, and then Joshua passes away. And then we enter a period of judges. So after Israel entering the promised land, we get to our next heading, which is the 12 judges. After Joshua, Israel is led by a series of 12 different judges. And as you read the book of Judges, you see this theme. And so it's a repeated theme where things are going well for Israel. They think, we're doing good, we don't need God. So they forget God. They forget God, things go bad. Things go bad, they cry out to God, we need your help. God sends them a judge to deliver them and to lead them. So God delivers them. Things start going well, rinse, recycle, repeat, or whatever the phrase is. They're like, oh, things are going well. We don't need God. They don't need God. Things go bad. They cry out to God. He gives them a judge. This just happens over and over and over again, but things progressively get worse. And so there's some cool stories in Judges, like a fat guy getting stabbed with a knife and it disappears. You've got like people lapping like dogs. I mean, there's crazy. You've got Samson. You've got hey there, Delilah. Like there's like some really cool things in Judges. Well, after Judges, we get to 1st and 2nd Samuel. Also, this would kind of, like I said, Ruth would be on the tail end of Judges, preceding 1st and 2nd Samuel. And that leads us to our next heading, which is the 3 kings of a united Israel. So Samuel is this kind of bridge between judges and kings. He's like a judge, he's like a prophet, and he ushers in a period of kingship. So the people of Israel, they're looking at other nations, and they're saying, they all have a king, we'd like a king. Samuel says, you don't want a king, it never ends well. And they're like, no, we do. So he's like, all right, I'm going to give you a king. So the first king of united Israel is Saul. All right, so Saul becomes the king. He does pretty well until he disqualifies himself. All right, so once he disqualifies himself, God has removed his anointing from Saul, and then Samuel is tasked with finding the replacement, which he goes to Jesse. How do we find Jesse? Well, if you read the book of Ruth, you'll meet Ruth and Boaz. Jesse was their grandson. Okay, so Jesse has 7 sons. He parades them in front of Samuel. The first 6, none of them are cutting it, but there's this one dude out in the field fighting lions and tigers and bears. And so David shows up, and it's like, that's the guy, this little short, ruddy kid. And so he's like, all right, this is going to be the next king of Israel. So David kills Goliath. The people love David, so they look at Saul, and they're like, you've killed your thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And Saul realizes that the favor of the Lord is now on David. The favor of the people are on David. So Saul throws spears at David as he's playing his harp, or lyre, whatever that thing is called. And eventually David goes on the run. There are multiple times when David could have killed Saul, but he's like, no, I'm waiting for God's timing, not my timing. And eventually Saul gets into a battle he can't win. He takes his own life, and then David becomes the king. So the first king of Israel is Saul. The second king is David. David is not a man without his flaws. Like, he goes down in history as a man after God's own heart, but he has this affair with Bathsheba. It ends bad. We see that he's a corrupt dude, but he writes a lot of the Psalms. And David and Bathsheba eventually have a son named Solomon, and God tells David, hey, when you pass away, Solomon will be the next king. And that gets us to 1st and 2nd Kings. So in 1st and 2nd Kings, David's passed away. Solomon is the next man up, the next king, and he has a dream. And God basically says, ask whatever you want and I'll give it to you. I mean, God's not a genie, but if he's ever looked like a genie, it's here. And so Solomon could have asked for fortune. He could have asked for fame. He could have asked for power, but he asked God for wisdom. He's like, God, if I'm going to lead your people, I need wisdom. And so God gives it to him. He's like, I'm going to give you wisdom, and I'm going to give you a lot of other things that you could have asked for, but you didn't. Solomon proves to be wise. Solomon gets the privilege of building the temple building God's house. So God's presence is no longer on the move through the Ark of the Covenant. It's established through the temple, a place to worship. But Solomon had a problem. He really liked women. A lot of wives, a lot of concubines, right? And so eventually God says, look, all these women you're pursuing, they worship foreign gods. And your heart is being pulled away from me and towards their gods. You've got to stop. And if you don't stop, like I'm gonna split the kingdom in half. So at this point, there's 3 kings of a united Israel. So God says, if you don't stop, I'm gonna split the kingdom. Well, guess what? Solomon doesn't stop. And then when God shows up and shows him the consequences, Solomon repents. He's like, I'm so sorry. I really messed up. And God goes, okay, I'm not going to split the kingdom while you're alive, but when you die, it's going to split. And so I believe it's probably during this time that Solomon wrote a lot of the wisdom literature. So wisdom literature, you're having things like Psalms that were written by David and other kings. You have Proverbs, you have Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentations. So real quick, let me explain to you the beauty of the wisdom literature. What Israel knew is that life was hard. Can anybody testify to that? Like life is not always a cupcake. Right? It's not always easy. And so Psalms were for Israel is saying like to make it through this hard life, we need to sing. So Psalms was a way for God's people to know to make it through life, we need to song. Proverbs is to make it through life, we need wisdom. And so a proverb is not a guarantee. It's a wise saying that's generally true, right? So if we're going to make it through life, we need wisdom. Ecclesiastes, if we're going to make it through life, we need purpose. We need a reason for existence. Song of Solomon, if we're going to make it through life, we need relationships. Lamentations was written during the prophets, but it's still included in wisdom literature by a lot of Jewish people because to make it through life, we need to know how to process all of our emotions. Even the sad ones, right? And so Solomon is really instrumental in a lot of the wisdom literature. But when Solomon passes away, guess what happens? The kingdom splits. So this leads us to our next heading, the kingdom splits. So after he dies, there's 2 kingdoms. So in the north, you have Israel. That's 10 tribes. There's 12 tribes when they're united, but now there's 10 in the north in Israel. Their capital is Samaria. All right, don't let me forget to tell you about why that's significant. All right, and then in the south, you have Judah. Judah is made up of 2 tribes. If you're doing the math, you're good. You're doing smart. All right, and so what happens is in about 722 BC, there is a world power called Assyria. Assyria shows up to the northern tribe of Israel, 10 tribes, right, the northern kingdom, and they conquer them. They completely conquer them. And so the Syrians' method was they would take people and disperse them. And so if they came to Johnson City, they would take all the Johnson Cityites, or whatever we're called, and they would say, all right, we're going to send you to Bristol, we're going to send you to Kingsport, we're going to send you to Morristown, we're going to send you to Knoxville. They would just disperse people all out, and then they would bring people from a variety of other places and replace you. So your house someone else from like Kingsport would be living in your house, and you're like, oh, don't bring that smell into my house, right? Like all of a sudden, and Kingsport people are mad, all right? And so, but you know, or is it Bristol that has this both smell? Johnson City's good, but all right, so all of a sudden, people are coming and living in your land. So that's the Syrian dispersion. The Syrians conquer the nation of Israel and disperse people. So it's interesting is eventually people return to the land, and they return to the land. Guess what happens? There's people living there, and so instead of those people who were dispersed to Samaria leaving, they just start to intermingle and they become half-breeds. That's why Samaritans are looked down upon in the New Testament. So that's just an interesting fact. That's all because of 722 BC and the Syrian dispersion. All right, so the Syrians, they march to Jerusalem, the southern tribe. They surround it, and they're ready to conquer it. And their history says that they had Jerusalem surrounded like a bird in a cage. So they think they're going to conquer it, and they can't. They can't conquer it because they think they've cut off Judah's water supply. But guess what? There's a secret tunnel that gives them access to water. And Jimbo, raise your hand back there, Jimbo. Me and Jimbo got to walk through that tunnel this summer. It's really cool. Like the secret tunnel. It's like, hey, we've got access to a water source the Syrians don't know about. And so because they had access to water, the Syrians couldn't conquer them. So eventually the Syrians leave. Well, about a little over 100 years later, Assyrians have kind of faded off the scene as the powerhouse, but there's been a rise of the Babylonians. So now the Babylonians are on the scene. And so when Babylon was like a little puppy, like a little cute puppy dog, one of the kings, Hezekiah in Judah, like brought the Babylonians into the temple to show them all the wealth. He's like, look how rich our God is. And he's like, that's really neat. They're a puppy at that point. Well, now they've grown up to like be a pit bull. And they're like, hey, remember how rich the temple was? We should go take that. And so the Babylonians go to the southern tribe of Judah and conquer them. And this is the Babylonian captivity. So the heading after the kingdom splits, then you have the Syrian dispersion. After that, the Babylonian captivity. So the Babylonians take all of Judah. They take the Israelites, they take them into captivity. This is known as the exile. So when you read like Daniel and his three friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, they were people taken by Babylon into exile. Okay, and so as you're reading through 1st and 2nd Kings, you'll see some prophets, like you'll see Isaiah writing during the time of 1st and 2nd Kings. You'll see Jonah in 1st and 2nd Kings. So some of the prophets were written before exile, some were written during exile, and others were written after exile. So you have the prophets. But after the Babylonian captivity, we get our final heading, which is return to the land. So after the Babylonians fade off of the scene as the powerhouse, you have the Persians, you have Artaxerxes, you've got like the movie 300, right? And so the Persians come onto the scene as the next power. And one of the things historically that the Persians did is they would actually resource people to go back to their homeland and to reestablish themselves. And so Israel benefited from this. So the Persians allow Israelites to go back to Jerusalem to rebuild their temple, to rebuild the city walls, to reestablish themselves. Obviously, there's strings attached. The Persians plan on taxing them heavily, but through the leadership of guys like Ezra and Nehemiah, and you'll also read Esther at this point. She didn't go back to the land, but there's a return to the land during the rule of the Persians. And after the people return to the land, if you read the book of Esther, right, which is like during this time of the Persians, in the book of Esther, guess who's never